Dear viewers, welcome to the world today. Ladies and gentlemen, there are days when the world does not move through isolated headlines, but through a chain of events, one after another, where a narrow strait can shake global oil prices, a diplomatic confrontation can push markets into panic, and a military decision that seems to exist only on a map can affect every ship, every port, every barrel of oil, every meal, and every household bill for millions of families. In today's edition of The World Today, we will take a closer look at the hottest global developments of the past 24 hours, from US-Iran tensions around the Strait of Hormuz, the maritime operation known as Project Freedom, Tehran's fierce response, the decision by major shipping companies to avoid key routes, to the strategic rivalry between the United States and China, the situation in Ukraine, attacks on Russia's energy infrastructure, and major military developments in the Middle East. The big question is this: is the world moving closer to a new energy crisis? Or are major powers using the crisis itself as leverage at the negotiating table? And now, let us begin with our first analysis. Ladies and gentlemen, the center of global attention remains the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most strategically important maritime routes in the world, where every military movement can create a chain reaction affecting energy markets, maritime insurance, supply chains, and regional security. According to the scenario described by several international reports, the fragile ceasefire agreement between the United States and Iran is at serious risk of breaking down. The immediate cause is Washington's announcement that it is launching an operation to help commercial vessels pass through the Strait of Hormuz, while Tehran sees this as the militarization of a shipping lane located directly next to Iran's vital security interests. US President Donald Trump has called this operation a humanitarian gesture, intended to open a safe passage for commercial ships trapped in the Gulf. But on the other side, Iran does not view this simply as a maritime protection mission. For Tehran, the presence of US warships, US aircraft, and American military assets around the Strait of Hormuz is a direct test of Iran's security limits. The issue is that Hormuz is not just a maritime route. Hormuz is the oil choke point of the world. A very large share of global crude oil and liquefied gas passes through this area. When Hormuz becomes unstable, energy prices can surge. When energy prices rise, transportation costs increase. When transportation costs rise, the prices of food, fertilizer, consumer goods, and production materials are also pushed higher. In other words, a missile flying over the Gulf may eventually show up in the gasoline, electricity, gas, and food bills of ordinary people thousands of kilometers away. According to the original script, US Central Command, commonly known as CENTCOM, contacted many shipowners and shipping companies to reassure them that passage through Hormuz was being protected. The United States was said to have deployed destroyers, aircraft from land-based facilities, carrier-based aircraft, and multiple defensive layers to create a protective umbrella for maritime activity. But what worries the shipping industry is that even though Washington speaks of freedom of navigation, shipowners still have to calculate real risks: missiles, drones, armed speedboats, naval mines, soaring insurance premiums, and the danger of being trapped in a war zone. For the shipping industry, even a small incident can change an entire route, cost structure, and scheduling plan. That is why MSC Mediterranean Shipping, the world's largest container shipping company, was reportedly planning to open a new trade route to avoid the Strait of Hormuz. This is a highly significant detail, when the world's largest shipping company has to consider bypassing Hormuz by combining ocean shipping, transit ports, and overland transport. It means the risk is no longer theoretical. It has become a real business calculation. According to the description, MSC's new route would connect Europe with Middle Eastern ports through an alternative corridor, using ports on the western coast of Saudi Arabia, then transporting cargo by road across the peninsula to the eastern coast, where smaller vessels would connect with gateways such as Abu Dhabi and Dubai's Jebel Ali. This may sound like a technical adjustment in the logistics industry, but in reality, it is a major signal. When cargo flows begin to avoid a strategic choke point, the world must prepare for three consequences: longer shipping times, higher costs, and greater uncertainty. Ladies and gentlemen, in global trade, uncertainty can sometimes be even more dangerous than high prices. High prices can be calculated, But uncertainty makes businesses unsure when to place orders, how much inventory to hold, how to sign contracts, and how much risk to pass on to consumers. Meanwhile, the United States claimed that it had helped several US-flagged commercial vessels pass safely through Hormuz. A vessel operated by Maersk was described as having left the Gulf under the protection of the US military. The shipping company said the crew was safe, the transit went smoothly, and there were no casualties. But the story does not end there. The United States said it was not directly escorting every vessel in the traditional sense, but instead establishing multiple layers of broad defense. This is a very notable choice of words. It suggests that Washington wants to avoid the image of sending civilian ships into a battlefield under military escort, while still demonstrating that the United States has the ability to reopen the shipping route. Iran, by contrast, responded in the opposite direction. Tehran warned that all commercial vessels and oil tankers wishing to move through Hormuz must coordinate with Iranian armed forces. At the same time, Iran threatened to attack US forces if they entered an area Tehran considers a vital security zone. This puts shipping companies in an extremely difficult position. If they coordinate with the United States, Iran may view them as siding with Washington. If they coordinate with Iran, the United States and its allies may become suspicious. If they coordinate with neither side, they risk being trapped, attacked, or denied insurance coverage. That is the paradox of freedom of navigation in wartime. Everyone claims to be protecting the safety of shipping. But the more forces declare that they are protecting it, the more dangerous the route becomes. On the other side, Iranian media denied some US claims, especially Washington's statement that it had destroyed several Iranian speedboats. Tehran said these were baseless claims and even accused the United States of mistakenly attacking civilian vessels carrying goods and passengers, causing casualties. If that accusation is true, it would represent a very serious escalation. But even if it is part of an information war, it still shows that both sides are now fighting for control of the narrative. The United States wants to tell the story that it is reopening a maritime route for the world. Iran wants to tell the story that the United States is the real source of instability, using humanitarian language to impose military power. Ladies and gentlemen, in modern crises, the media battle often comes before the battle at sea. Whoever wins legitimacy gains more room to act. That is why the name Project Freedom is not merely the name of an operation. It is a political message. Previously, Washington was said to have used stronger and more aggressive language. But by shifting to Project Freedom, the United States appears to be reframing the operation from a military campaign into a mission to defend freedom of navigation, protect trade, and secure the flow of essential goods. This naming strategy serves two goals. First, it helps persuade allies that this is not just another American military adventure. Second, it creates leverage over Iran at the negotiating table. If the United States can prove that it is still able to open a corridor through Hormuz, Iran's ability to use the strait as a strategic chokehold will be weakened. But on the other hand, if Iran can create enough risk that shipping companies still refuse to pass through, Tehran will preserve its most important strategic card. In other words, Hormuz is no longer just a sea lane. Hormuz is a chessboard. Commercial ships are the pieces. Oil prices are the pressure gauge. And international public opinion is the referee, though not an entirely neutral one. Ladies and gentlemen, while US-Iran tensions continue to escalate, the United Arab Emirates, especially the Fujairah area, has also become a major focus. Fujairah lies outside the Strait of Hormuz and is viewed as one of the strategic outlets for Gulf oil when Hormuz is threatened. If Fujairah is attacked, the message is clear: even routes designed to bypass Hormuz are not completely safe. That could create panic in the energy sector, because Gulf states have long invested in infrastructure to reduce dependence on Hormuz. But if alternative ports, oil storage sites, energy industrial zones, and export routes outside Hormuz also come under threat, the entire energy security map of the region will have to be recalculated. According to the original script, the UAE said its air defense systems intercepted multiple missiles and drones from Iran. While several workers were injured, Qatar condemned the attacks and described them as a serious threat to regional security. What is notable here is that the UAE is a major trade, financial, logistics, and energy hub. When the UAE is pulled deeper into the confrontation, Global businesses immediately have to ask, is the Gulf still stable enough to remain a central hub for goods, oil, and finance? At the same time, South Korea also moved quickly after a ship operated by one of its companies caught fire in the area. Seoul ordered South Korean flagged vessels in the region to increase vigilance, move to safer positions, and wait for a full investigation into the exact cause. This shows that the Hormuz crisis is no longer only a story about the United States, Iran, or Arab countries. It has become an Asian issue. Japan, South Korea, China, India, and many other energy-importing economies must monitor the situation closely. For them, 1 week of instability in Hormuz can become months of pressure on import prices, industrial production, and inflation. Ladies and gentlemen, when we look at the Middle East crisis, we cannot ignore the issue of Iran's nuclear program. According to the original script, US intelligence agencies still maintain the assessment that Iran would need about 1 year to build a nuclear weapon, even after waves of attacks by the United States and Israel. If confirmed, this would be highly sensitive information. It suggests that airstrikes may cause major damage to military infrastructure or certain nuclear facilities, but may not be enough to significantly slow the core capability of Iran's nuclear program. The biggest issue is nuclear material. If a quantity of highly enriched uranium remains unverified in terms of location, then any claim that the nuclear program has been wiped out must be treated with caution. A facility can be bombed, but materials, experts, technology, data, and political will are not easily destroyed by a single round of airstrikes. This is a lesson repeated in many nuclear crises. Military power can delay, but it is very difficult to completely eliminate a nuclear program without a political agreement. That is why Iran's foreign minister's statement that there is no military solution to a political crisis is worth noting. Of course, that is Tehran's position, but it reflects a broader truth. If the ultimate goal is to control the nuclear program, ensure maritime security, and prevent regional war, then the parties will eventually have to return to the negotiating table. But the problem is this: negotiations after missiles have already been fired are far more difficult than negotiations before a war begins. Ladies and gentlemen, while the United States is being drawn into Iran, another diplomatic front is emerging: US-China relations. According to the original script, President Donald Trump was said to be seeking a meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping in Beijing in May 2026. If this meeting takes place, it will not be an ordinary bilateral meeting. It will be a meeting between the world's two largest powers at a time when the Middle East is unstable. Energy markets are volatile, supply chains are under pressure, and the technology and trade rivalry has not cooled down. What is interesting is that the Iran crisis could both weaken and create opportunities for the United States at the negotiating table with China. If the United States can prove that it controls the situation in the Middle East, reopens Hormuz, and forces Iran to de-escalate, then Mr. Trump will arrive in Beijing in a stronger position. But if the United States is trapped, unable to resolve Iran, unable to stabilize Hormuz, facing rising oil prices and domestic opposition to military action, then Beijing will see a Washington whose resources are being stretched. This is where China may find an opportunity. Beijing has a vast domestic market, an important role in rare earth supply chains, energy relationships with many countries, and the ability to present itself as a pillar of stability in the eyes of some international partners. One particularly notable observation in the original script is, the United States is fighting without winning, while China is winning without fighting. Although this is a commentary-style statement, it reflects part of how Beijing often operates, limiting direct military involvement while taking advantage of the strategic exhaustion of its rivals to expand diplomatic and economic influence. However, China is not free from risk. Beijing depends heavily on energy imports. If Hormuz is blocked for a prolonged period, China will also suffer. Rising oil prices can increase production costs. Instability in the Middle East can affect China's projects in the region. And if the United States imposes additional sanctions on Chinese refineries linked to Iranian oil, trade tensions could flare up again. Therefore, in US-China relations, Iran is not just a distant hotspot. Iran may become a card in a larger negotiation over trade, technology, energy, sanctions, and even Taiwan. Ladies and gentlemen, while the Middle East heats up global energy markets, The war in Ukraine remains a long-term flashpoint for European security. According to the original script, Russia continues to advance on several fronts, while Ukraine is responding with long-range strikes against military and energy infrastructure deep inside Russian territory. One of the notable details is that Ukraine was said to have used a Flamingo cruise missile to attack a Russian defense plant. If this information is accurate, it shows that Ukraine's long-range strike capability is developing. In the early stages of the war, Ukraine mainly defended itself and relied heavily on Western weapons. But over time, Kyiv has increasingly invested in drones, domestic missiles, and operations that strike deep into Russia's rear areas. Ukraine's strategy is quite clear: do not only fight on the front line, but also hit logistics, defense industry facilities, oil refineries, fuel depots, export ports, and even vessels belonging to Russia's so-called shadow fleet. This is how Ukraine is trying to increase the cost of war for Moscow. Russia has advantages in territory, artillery, manpower, and strategic depth. If Ukraine only fights on the front line, it will face enormous pressure. But if Ukraine can set refineries on fire, threaten ports, increase maritime insurance risks, and disrupt Russian oil exports, then Kyiv can shift part of the pressure back onto Moscow. However, this strategy also carries risks. Attacks on energy infrastructure can cause environmental pollution, prolonged fires, toxic smoke, black rain, and civilian damage. According to the original script, some areas in Russia reported black smoke, coastal pollution, and public health concerns after attacks on oil refineries. This is one of the dark sides of modern war. When energy becomes a target, the consequences are not only economic, they also affect the environment, health, water, air, and civilian life. At the same time, the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant remains a particularly dangerous risk point. The International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, has repeatedly warned about safety in this area. Even damage to a meteorological monitoring device caused by a drone is enough to raise concern. Because a nuclear plant is unlike any other industrial facility, a mistake there could create cross-border consequences. Ladies and gentlemen, another development in the Ukraine war involves corruption allegations, political infighting, and internal power struggles. According to the original script, Ukraine's anti-corruption agencies investigated wrongdoing in the nuclear energy sector, while some former security officials claimed they had been framed for political purposes. This reflects a major challenge for Ukraine. It must fight Russia on the battlefield while also maintaining Western trust by fighting corruption, reforming institutions, and proving that international aid is not being abused. For Kyiv, corruption is not only a moral or legal issue, it is a national security issue. If the West loses trust, military and financial aid may decline. If the Ukrainian public loses trust, the country's wartime morale may be weakened. And if political factions use anti-corruption campaigns as tools to destroy one another, the state will be weakened from within. In a long war, strength does not only come from tanks, missiles, or drones, it also comes from the ability to keep the state from collapsing under suspicion, corruption, and internal conflict. Ladies and gentlemen, returning to the Middle East, Israel is also quietly adjusting its military strategy. Although Israel does not possess aircraft carriers like the United States, it is building an increasingly powerful long-range air capability based on F-35 fighters, F-15IA aircraft, heavy-lift helicopters, and KC-46 aerial refueling tankers. This is a very important point. In the Middle Eastern security environment, Israel cannot prepare only for short border clashes. After the October 7, 2023 attack by Hamas and prolonged confrontations with Hezbollah, the Houthis, Iran, and other armed groups, Israel has realized that it must prepare for a long, multi-front war with regional depth. The KC-46 refueling aircraft is especially important because it extends the operational range of the Israeli Air Force. If an air force can refuel in the air, it can strike farther, maintain presence longer, and act more flexibly in scenarios involving Iran or targets far beyond its borders. In other words, Israel does not have an aircraft carrier, but it is trying to create an airborne aircraft carrier through a network of fighter jets, refueling aircraft, intelligence systems, and command technology. This worries countries in the region, as Israel expands its long-range strike capabilities. Its rivals will also strengthen air defenses, missiles, drones, and deterrence capabilities. The security spiral continues. At the same time, the UAE was said to have delayed the transfer of several Mirage 2009 fighter jets to Morocco due to tensions with Iran. This is also a notable signal. When a country decides to keep older aircraft instead of transferring them to a partner, it shows that it assesses the immediate threat is serious enough to avoid creating any capability gap. For Morocco, this delay affects its Air Force modernization program. But for the UAE, the priority now is to protect its skies, oil ports, industrial zones, and deterrence capability amid instability in the Gulf. Ladies and gentlemen, the energy crisis is also creating difficult choices for Japan. According to the original script, a shipment of crude oil from Russia's Sakhalin project arrived at a Japanese port as Tokyo sought to diversify its supply sources due to risks in the Middle East. Japan is a resource-poor country that depends heavily on energy imports, especially from the Middle East. When Hormuz becomes unstable, Tokyo has few easy choices. On the one hand, Japan is a US ally and has joined many sanctions against Russia over the war in Ukraine. On the other hand, energy security is a matter of survival. This is the paradox facing energy importing countries. Politically, they may want to stand on one side, but in energy terms, they must make sure the lights stay on, factories keep running, and people have fuel. Japan's maintenance of certain exemptions at energy channels linked to the Sakhalin project shows that even close US allies must calculate their practical interests. When the Middle East is unstable, Russia, despite sanctions, can still become an alternative source of supply for some Asian countries. This does not mean Japan-Russia relations are improving, but it shows that energy is always a field where political morality, strategic alliances, and economic necessity collide directly. Ladies and gentlemen, besides Iran, Ukraine, and the Middle East, another security issue continues to trouble Washington: North Korea. According to the original script, North Korea's military capability, from tanks and short-range missiles to intercontinental ballistic missiles and nuclear material, has developed significantly over the years. What is alarming is not only the number of nuclear warheads, but also the pace of fissile material production and the diversity of delivery systems. If North Korea can produce more nuclear material every year, develop intercontinental missiles, expand mobile launches, and improve its ability to penetrate missile defenses, the United States will face a very difficult problem. The US missile defense system was designed to deal with a limited threat. But if the number of missiles and warheads increases, absolute defense becomes almost impossible. This becomes even more complicated when the United States must simultaneously pay attention to Iran, Russia, China, and Ukraine. A superpower may have the strongest military in the world, but political, military, and financial resources are still limited. When there are too many hotspots at the same time, deterrence at each point can become diluted. And that is exactly what many US rivals are watching closely. How far is Washington being stretched? Ladies and gentlemen, inside the United States, the war with Iran is also becoming a domestic political issue. According to the original script, polls showed rising dissatisfaction with President Donald Trump, especially regarding how he handled the conflict with Iran. Mr. Trump strongly rejected those surveys, calling them fake and arguing that the real question should be whether Iran should be allowed to possess nuclear weapons. This is a familiar media strategy. When criticized over war, Mr. Trump shifts the focus from "do people support the campaign?" to "do people want Iran to have nuclear weapons?" These are two different questions. A person may not want Iran to have nuclear weapons, but may also not want the United States to enter another war. That is the gap between goals and methods. In politics, many leaders emphasize the goal to justify the method, but voters care about the cost: how much money, how many lives, how long it will last, and how it will end. If the Iran campaign drags on, Mr. Trump may face significant pressure from anti-war voices, independent voters, and even some within the Republican Party. If the campaign ends quickly with a favorable result, he may turn it into a political victory. But if it becomes a stalemate, potential successors such as Marco Rubio or J.D. Vance will also be forced to define their positions. Mr. Rubio, with his diplomatic and security role, could benefit if the campaign succeeds. By contrast, Mr. Vance, with a more cautious image regarding military intervention, could benefit if the American public grows tired of war. Therefore, Iran is not only a foreign policy problem for the United States. It is also a test for the political future after Trump. Ladies and gentlemen, when all these hotspots are connected, we see a larger picture. The world is entering a period in which crises are no longer separate. Hormuz affects oil prices in Asia. Oil prices affect China, Japan, and Europe. The war in Ukraine affects Russia's energy market. Russia benefits from higher oil prices to offset losses. The United States is confronting Iran while also calculating China, North Korea, and domestic elections. Israel is strengthening its air force. The UAE is holding on to fighter jets. Shipping companies are rerouting. Businesses and ordinary people ultimately pay the final cost. That is the world of 2026, a world where geopolitics has moved directly into supply chains. And supply chains have moved directly into daily life. In the past, war was often viewed as a matter for armies. Today, war is also a matter of ports, insurance, crude oil, fertilizer, semiconductors, rare earths, container ships, inflation, and market confidence. A threatened strait can cause a shipping company to change its route. A changed route can raise transportation costs. Higher transportation costs can raise commodity prices. Higher commodity prices can anger voters. Angry voters can change the policies of a major power, and the policies of a major power can once again reshape the situation at that same strait. That is the geopolitical circle of the new era. Ladies and gentlemen, the important question now is, what scenarios could unfold in the coming days? The first scenario is controlled de-escalation. The United States continues to maintain its military presence. Iran continues to issue warnings but avoids direct attacks on US forces. Commercial vessels gradually pass through Hormuz under a temporary security mechanism, and negotiations resume through intermediaries. This is the best scenario for markets, but it requires both sides to de-escalate while still saving face. The second scenario is prolonged tension. Hormuz is not completely closed, but it is not safe either. Some ships pass through, while others avoid the route. Insurance prices rise, transportation costs increase, and oil prices fluctuate sharply. This is a very plausible scenario because it allows all sides to continue applying pressure without crossing the threshold into full-scale war. The third scenario is military escalation. A ship is sunk, a base is attacked, a major oil port catches fire, or a miscalculation causes casualties among US or Iranian personnel. In that case, the pressure to retaliate would be enormous, and the region could enter a much more dangerous spiral. The fourth scenario is a wider regional crisis. The UAE, Israel, armed groups in the region, Iraq, Yemen, Syria, or other maritime routes could be drawn in. This is the scenario energy markets fear the most, because it would not only involve Hormuz, but the entire security structure of the Middle East. For ordinary people, what needs to be watched is not only missiles or warships, but three practical signals: global oil prices, shipping fees, and the reactions of major energy importing countries such as China, Japan, South Korea, and India. If these countries begin buying reserves aggressively, urgently seeking alternative sources, or expressing serious concern about supply, it means the crisis has moved beyond the military sphere and entered the economy of daily life. Ladies and gentlemen, today's report shows that the world is at a highly sensitive moment. The United States wants to prove that it can still protect the global maritime order. Iran wants to prove that it still holds the Hormuz card. China wants to use America's distraction to strengthen its position. Russia wants to turn energy volatility into an advantage. Ukraine wants to strike Russia's logistics and revenue sources. Israel wants to expand its long-range strike capability. Gulf countries want to protect their oil ports and airspace. Meanwhile, shipping companies, businesses, and ordinary people simply hope that supply chains do not break again. But history shows that major crises do not usually begin with one single decision. They begin with many small steps: a warning, an interception, a ship changing route, a spike in oil prices, a hardline statement, a damaging opinion poll, a postponed meeting. When those small steps connect, the world suddenly realizes it has moved very close to the edge. And that is exactly what we must watch in the coming days. Will Project Freedom truly restore freedom of navigation? Or will it become the symbol of a new confrontation between the United States and Iran? Will Iran use Hormuz as a bargaining chip? Or turn it into a battlefield? Will China stand aside and observe? Or quietly shape the chessboard from behind the scenes? Will the war in Ukraine continue to spread into Russia's energy infrastructure, bringing deeper environmental and economic consequences? And most importantly, does the world still have enough diplomatic space to pull the parties back from a spiral that no one truly controls? Ladies and gentlemen, in a world full of instability, what matters is not only knowing what is happening, but understanding why it is happening, who benefits, who suffers, and how it may affect our daily lives. That is also the mission of the world today, not only to report the news, but to help you look deeper behind every headline. Thank you for spending your time with us today. If you found this program useful, please continue to follow the world today in our upcoming analysis reports. Every follow, share, and comment from you is a source of motivation for us to continue bringing clearer, calmer, and deeper perspectives on a world that is changing by the hour. We wish you peace, clarity, and the ability to maintain an independent perspective amid every global upheaval. This is the world today. Thank you for watching, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next program.